Imagine standing at the center of Germany's industrial heart, a country once defined by efficient steel mills, quiet chemical reactors, and precision-engineered assembly lines. You built products the world depended on. Your economy was thriving. Then, silence, not due to strikes, not because demand vanished, but because the factory, a lifeline of your business, could no longer afford to operate. Not from scarcity of labor or materials, but from an energy grid so fragile and expensive that keeping the lights on became a liability. This is not science fiction. This is Germany in 2023. What was once the economic engine of Europe found itself caught in a crisis of its own making. Years of policies celebrated as progressive and climate responsible had collapsed into a reality of rolling blackouts, shuttered industries, and national uncertainty. Germany spent over $500 billion to lead the world into a green energy future. Instead, it exposed itself to the cold physics of power, not in theory, but in practice. The question is not whether green energy has a place in the 21st century. The question is how one of the world's most advanced economies engineered its own energy emergency, and what the rest of the world can learn before repeating it. To understand how Germany arrived at the brink of an energy collapse, one must return to the decision that triggered it all: the sudden abandonment of nuclear power. In the early 2010s, Germany had achieved an enviable balance in its energy mix. Nuclear power supplied approximately 25% of the country's electricity. It was reliable, carbon-free, and economically efficient. The German government, led by Chancellor Angela Merkel, herself a trained scientist, had extended the life of the country's nuclear reactors. At the time, it was considered a measured, pragmatic approach to gradually phasing in more renewables. Then came Fukushima in March 2011. A tsunami struck Japan's coastline and overwhelmed the safety systems of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant. The images were alarming. The political pressure in Germany was immediate. Protests surged. Public fear escalated. And within days, Merkel reversed course. The government announced the total phase-out of nuclear energy. 8 reactors were shut down immediately. Germany had turned its back on one of its most stable forms of clean energy. Not as a result of technical review or failure within its own borders, but due to fear sparked by a natural disaster 9,000 kilometers away. This decision was not just dramatic. It was foundational. Rather than investing green energy funds into expanding capacity, Germany began using them to replace functioning nuclear infrastructure. Billions were deployed to substitute one form of zero-carbon electricity for another. Net output did not increase. The country merely ran in place, except with higher costs and lower reliability. Carbon emissions stayed flat. Prices for consumers soared. And when the sun did not shine or the wind did not blow, especially common in Northern Europe, there was no nuclear safety net to fall back on. Germany did not just walk away from nuclear power. It dismantled it before the alternative was truly ready. And in that moment, the green energy transition veered off course. By removing nuclear power from its energy arsenal, Germany created a dangerous vacuum, one that needed to be filled quickly, reliably, and affordably. The solution was natural gas. It was cleaner than coal, readily available, ideal for balancing the intermittent output of wind and solar. There was just one problem. Germany did not have significant domestic gas reserves. So it turned to imports. And no partner seemed more economically convenient or more geopolitically naive than Russia. For years, Germany embraced a policy called Wandel durch Handel, or change through trade. It was a hopeful doctrine suggesting that deep economic ties would bring political stability even with adversaries. The theory was simple. If Russia became a major energy supplier to Europe, the mutual dependency would prevent conflict. What unfolded was quite different. By 2021, 55% of Germany's natural gas came from Russia. Pipelines like Nord Stream 1 and the planned Nord Stream 2 were built to ferry cheap Siberian gas directly into the heart of Germany's industrial sector. That gas powered factories, heated homes, and fueled the manufacturing engine that had lifted Germany to global leadership. Executives and politicians assured themselves that economic logic would prevail. But while Germany saw opportunity, others in Europe saw a trap. Poland, the Baltic nations, and Ukraine issued repeated warnings that over-reliance on Moscow gave the Kremlin leverage, not partnership, when Russian tanks crossed into Ukraine in February 2022. Those warnings became reality. Russia began to throttle gas supplies. Prices exploded. In a matter of weeks, German factories that had run for decades went silent. The government scrambled to secure liquefied natural gas contracts at vastly higher costs. Even as utility companies collapsed under the weight of sudden energy shortfalls, Germany did not just lose a fuel source. It lost the foundation of its industrial economy. The $500 billion energy transition that was supposed to empower the nation had made it vulnerable. The choice to abandon nuclear and depend on Russian gas was not a bridge. It was a deal with a dealer, and when that dealer turned hostile, there was nowhere left to turn. For decades, the phrase "made in Germany" carried unmatched weight. It represented engineering excellence, industrial strength, and economic reliability. From automobiles to industrial equipment to world-class pharmaceuticals, German products dominated global markets. But by 2023, that legacy began to unravel. Not because of technological weakness, but because of rising energy prices and fractured policy decisions. The industrial sector, the backbone of Germany's economy, was no longer competitive. Long-term energy costs had soared beyond sustainable levels, and companies began to leave. At the center of this transformation is BASF, the largest chemical producer in the world. Its flagship plant in Ludwigshafen once consumed as much natural gas as the entire country of Switzerland. That plant, a symbol of Germany's industrial might, began downsizing. Over 2,600 jobs were cut. Ammonia production, a core input in agriculture and pharmaceuticals, was reduced. Where did BASF go next? China, $10 billion Australian investment, shifted overseas, with the company citing more stable energy prices and supportive government policy. BASF was not alone. Volkswagen, Miele, and other German giants began diversifying their operations to countries like the United States, Canada, and Poland, chasing subsidies, lower energy bills, and less aggressive regulatory frameworks in economics. These shifts are sometimes labeled structural change, but in reality, this is deindustrialization. Germany is not a service-heavy, Silicon Valley-style economy. It builds things, machinery, precision tools, chemicals, vehicles. These are the lifeblood of a society that depends on production, not just consumption. When those factories close, they do not reopen easily. When those jobs are lost, they often do not return. This is not simply a matter of declining profits. It is an erosion of national strength, one that touches communities, middle-class stability, and the very architecture of the economy. What began as a climate initiative has triggered something far more dangerous: a hollowing out of the very prosperity it was meant to protect. Germany's industry is not evolving. It is leaving, and with it goes a century of industrial dominance. If the energy transition was a bridge, Germany discovered too late that it had not finished building it before stepping off the edge. Wind power was expanded at record speed across the northern coastline, where consistent oceanic winds made turbines an effective renewable source. But Germany's industrial centers are not in the north, they are in the south. Bavaria, Baden-Württemberg, and other regions where giants like Siemens and BMW operate, to move power from one end of the country to the other. Germany planned a major infrastructure project, Südlink, a high-voltage transmission line that would function as the nation's new energy artery. Originally slated for completion by 2022, in time for the nuclear shutdown. The project has been mired in delays due to lawsuits, bureaucracy, and local opposition. The solution? Bury the cables. The cost? Tripled. The timeline? Delayed now, projected for completion maybe by 2028. During storms in the north, turbines spin with excess electricity, but the grid cannot handle it. The power has no path south. So grid operators are forced to shut the turbines down to prevent overload. The turbines still get paid. This phenomenon is called redispatch, or more bluntly, ghost electricity. In 2022 alone, German consumers paid $4.2 billion for electricity that was never delivered. Meanwhile, Southern industries must restart coal and gas plants to keep running the very emissions Germany sought to avoid. The result is surreal. Consumers are paying more for less. Green power is being produced, but not used. And fossil fuels are switched on to fill the gaps. This is not transition. It is dysfunction. The grid crisis is not a technical failure. It is a planning failure, one born from rapid ambition, political pressure, and a refusal to match infrastructure timelines with policy targets. In theory, the grid was supposed to connect the green future. In practice, it silenced half the turbines and doubled the nation's power bill. While Germany's energy policy had already crippled its industry, a new wave of resistance emerged when the consequences reached households directly in 2023. The German government introduced a sweeping law aimed at eliminating gas and oil heating systems. The proposed legislation would effectively ban new fossil fuel-powered boilers starting in 2024, ushering in a mandatory shift toward electric heat pumps. In principle, the move aligned with Germany's climate goals. In practice, it collided with economic reality. Heat pumps are efficient, but they are also expensive and impractical for many older German homes. These buildings, often constructed decades ago with brick or stone, lack the insulation necessary for efficient heat pump operation. To retrofit them requires floor replacements, wall insulation, and upgraded radiators, often costing between $20,000 to $50,000 per household. The public backlash was swift and fierce, rather than inspiring climate cooperation. The policy was seen as a financial threat to middle and working-class homeowners. Tabloids dubbed it the heat hammer. Approval ratings for the Green Party collapsed. The far-right alternative for Germany capitalized on the fury, surging in the polls by promising to leave boilers untouched. What was intended as technological progress quickly became a case study in political fragility. The bill had to be rewritten with multiple exemptions, delays, and diluted enforcement. Ironically, the emotional panic sparked a counterproductive outcome. Households, fearing the ban, rushed to install new gas systems before the deadline, locking in fossil fuel use for years to come. This was not leadership. It was policy by panic. Germany did not merely miscommunicate climate policy. It failed to understand its citizens, and in doing so, turned environmental reform into a national crisis of trust. By 2023, Germany's government celebrated what appeared to be a breakthrough. Carbon emissions had dropped to their lowest level in over 70 years. Climate targets were technically met, and charts showed a steady decline in national output of carbon dioxide. But beneath the headlines, the reality was far more troubling. Emissions did not fall because Germany had perfected green energy. They fell because factories shut down, steel mills went cold, chemical plants idled, paper production slowed. Industrial output, the very driver of German economic success, shrank by nearly 20%. In other words, the carbon curve bent downward because the economy bent with it. This was not environmental success. It was industrial erosion masked as progress. Furthermore, without nuclear power and with a lagging grid, Germany continued to rely on dirtier energy than its neighbors. France, which generates roughly 70% of its electricity from nuclear plants, boasts some of the cleanest electricity in Europe. Germany, by contrast, repeatedly failed to stay below its intended carbon intensity ceilings, even while citizens drove electric vehicles. They charged them with energy many times dirtier than France's, a paradox in a country celebrated as a green pioneer. In an effort to lead, Germany is now struggling to follow its own directives. It met emission goals, not with innovation, but with economic contraction. And if shutting down factories is the only way to hit your climate targets, it raises a deeper question. What exactly are you saving? Germany's green energy experiment was never driven by malice or ignorance. It was guided by ambition, the belief that a modern industrial economy could reform itself to meet the demands of the climate crisis. But good intentions are not a substitute for strategy. An ideology cannot replace engineering. Germany spent over $500 billion to transform its energy system, but without securing a reliable baseload, without finishing the grid to carry its renewable power, and without trusting the science behind nuclear technology. It built a framework that could not deliver. The result was an energy paradox. Higher prices hollowed industry. An emissions reduction that came only by shutting down production. Other nations are watching. And they are not copying the German model. They're investing in nuclear, in redundancies, and in energy diversity. So what is the true lesson? That energy policy, like all infrastructure, must follow physics, mathematics, and economics, not politics, headlines, or emotion. An idea may win votes or headlines, but if it cannot keep the lights on, it collapses. Germany learned this lesson at a tremendous cost. The only question now is whether the rest of the world insists on learning it the same way or decides to learn it for free.